The African delegation of leaders' peace mission to Ukraine and Russia concluded yesterday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said negotiations can only start when Russian forces withdraw from his country, while the Russian President Vladimir Putin accused Zelensky of blocking peace talks. Meanwhile, President Cyril Ramaphosa declared the mission impactful. One analyst believes the West should have been part of the talks. Let's get some perspective now from conflict resolution expert Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. Thank you so much for making time for us, Dr. Makhubela. How do you assess the impact of this African peace mission from what the President communicated yesterday at the end of the talks with both the President? He says it was impactful, and his reasoning is that the fact that the two leaders were willing to listen to the proposed peace plan was already a success.
Thank you, Clement. Well, the impact and success are totally different. The visit, of course, had an impact maybe on them to better understand the dynamics of the conflict. The parties to the conflict are as divergent, and their divergent view is as apart as they were before the mission. So there hasn't been any success to bring them much closer to each other, mainly because of the conditions that are imposed by both parties in the conflict. So we are still having a stalemate with respect to any possible peaceful resolution at this moment.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like it was a usual, blame game, and I suppose that was expected, so to speak. During the talks, you had the president of Ukraine saying that, well, before anything else, we need Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. And then you've got the Russian president also coming back and saying, well, this is the man who is just trying to block these peace talks. So ultimately, that's going to be difficult to get these two parties to sit, especially when they are still so far apart on opposite ends when it comes to their conditions.
I mean, the Ukrainians have imposed conditions that are virtually impossible for any negotiations. They are demanding the total withdrawal of the Russians. They are demanding reparations. Essentially, they are seeking capitulation of Russia at this stage. And I think issues that are really putting them apart should have been a subject of negotiation. So you can see the Ukrainians are not willing for that. And not only the Ukrainian, the West, which is backing the Ukrainian, is quite emphatic that there can't be any negotiations at this moment. But again, Clement, the timing of the African mission was just unfortunate. It happened at a time when the Ukrainians are launching their counteroffensive. The Russians have fortified their position in terms of defending the position they occupy. The Russians are actually having successes in terms of decimating some of the tanks that were sent to Ukraine. So you can see both parties are quite buoyant in terms of this conflict. They think they can win the conflict in the battlefield. And therefore it makes it virtually impossible to find a peaceful solution at this time. And I think, as I'm saying, timing is just unfortunate.
What do you think of the way the mission of African heads of state was communicated? Are they all on the same page about where the continent stands? Because the AU chair and Comoros president said there's no debate. All of us are on the side of Ukraine. And this is what he said when he was asked about Ukraine's territorial integrity and the United Nations Charter. I thought that's a statement that I would imagine goes against the spirit of this so-called non-alignment.
Except non-alignment, all countries that went there, they probably have their own positions. But the discussion there was not about their position, was not how they feel about the territorial integrity concept. Was about issues that both parties are having a dispute around. And as a mediator, always you try to avoid putting your views before the issues that are under dispute. You allow the parties to discuss whatever is putting them apart and listen to them. To really start making such statements, I was quite concerned by the Comoros president statement to say we entirely agree with the Ukrainians. I mean, it's not up to them. The discussion is not about how they feel about the concept of territorial integrity. It's about how the Ukrainians are differing with the Russians, their interpretation of the concept. As fate would have it, when they arrived in Moscow, President Putin was able to start lecturing them about his understanding of the concept of territorial integrity and the UN Charter. And they should have stayed out of those issues. They compromised themselves by starting to articulate their views before even listening to the other side.
Yeah, and I mean, the Russian president took some time to also go through the Minsk agreements. So he took them many decades decades back. What do you make of just how the talks transpired? There are those who are giving President Cyril Ramaphosa says, well, we are the first group that has met and engaged the two leaders coming from this, non-aligned position. But when you look at how they negotiated with Putin, with Vladimir Zelensky, when you look at how they've sat down with Putin, the president, and Vladimir Putin, do you get a sense that, even the posture, when you look at the pictures, these are presidents who were honestly and genuinely interested in hearing what these African leaders had to say, and that they thought they could, in fact, genuinely consider the peace plan?
I think there are issues that could have been handled totally differently. One of the issues was with Zelensky to really raise that we are being affected because of the grains and fertilizers. You could see Zelensky took an umbrage at that kind of an argument to say the war has gone beyond fertilizers and bread issues. This is about lives. And I think they should have been a bit sensitive about that. You can't go to a war zone and speak about we are worried about our bread basket when life is being lost. Yeah. If really our bread basket depends on the Ukrainians' workforce, resolving the problem of the Ukrainian workforce, it provides some assurance to the flow of bread. I think the casting of this issue was unfortunate. The media also here, I've seen some articles in our domestic media, they were calling it a peace and grain mission. You can't start to phrase this kind of a conflict in this manner. It creates problems. That's one thing. The second issue, it was during the discussion in Moscow, when it was stated that part of the conditions is the return of the children, and the return of those children that were taken by Russia in some part of the war zone. It's part of what the ICC charged President Putin about. And those are children of Russian-speaking children. And the Russians argue that they are taking those children to save them. Yeah. Now, those are things that you don't have to state your views. You have to allow parties to negotiate and come to some conclusions about it. So we started to state our views, and that really created some problem. Quite clearly, the mission was bound to fail because of the manner in which it was handled. And of course, Clement, when you start having a large number of heads of state who are actually running a negotiation or a peace mission themselves, without any prior work done by technocrats and people who are knowledgeable in the conflict resolution, you are bound to have this kind of communication, and it creates a problem. Yeah. And I think by the time they arrive in Moscow, Moscow has made up its mind that they're not going to accept anything from the delegation. Yeah.
Just as we wrap up, Dr. Makhubela, when you look at the two conditions, because I imagine they tell us a lot about, in some way, the kind of sway this African peace delegation wanted to have. I mean, when you look at, you mentioned the children now, what part of the plan is the release of prisoners of war and the release of children who were taken out of Ukraine. And you've already indicated Russia says we've not done anything wrong. In fact, we are saving these children. But for the African peace mission to take this posture then says to me, then they have believed what President Volodymyr Zelensky has had to say in how he approached this issue of children who were taken away. And the last position that the African heads had was that there must be a recognition of the sovereignty of countries in terms of the United Nations Charter, and that has got to be met. And when you look at that charter itself, it calls for all UN members to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states. So basically what they're saying is, Russia, you have no business, regardless of what you may disagree with Ukraine, you have no business getting in and disrespecting that United Nations Charter on that aspect of sovereignty.
That's why President Putin was at pains to say the same charter provides the basis for countries to for self-determination. The same principle was used in Kosovo when Kosovo seceded from Serbia. And the Russians are really emphatic about that precedent that was set up in Kosovo. And that's why they're justifying that in terms of the areas that have decided to secede from Ukraine. So they were lost in terms of preparation, in my own view, the Afghan heads of state. They shouldn't have raised those issues because a certain precedent that has started and recognized by the United Nations itself and are catered for in the UN Charter. So they were in uncharted territory. The mission was not properly prepared. In my own view, they should have had a lot of experts who prepared them about the dynamics of these issues and how to phrase and frame them. But it's a problem of having a large number of heads of state with their own views and stating issues as they come up without thinking about the possible consequences of them in the long run. And those issues, they should have been part of the discussion. Even the question of the children, the return of the children. Do they really know who are the parents of those children? What happened to the parents of the children? Because the Russians are arguing that they were saving them from a war zone. It may be valid that they saved those children from a war zone, but no one has done a detailed analysis and research to find out if this is really a point that should be raised at that level.
Yeah. Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, I appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.